We're gonna.
Good evening, good evening. Please come find a seat. Yeah. We're not going to do Good evening, welcome. Nice to have you here. Shana Tova. Nice to have everybody here. Welcome. It's great to be here together. This is the beginning of the 14th year of the Valley Beth Shalom College of Jewish Studies. So I welcome all of you. College of Jewish Studies offers university-level learning in Judaism and Jewish culture without no quizzes, no homework, no tests, no football team, no sororities. Chances to learn. And we're delighted that everyone is with us tonight. Tonight's the beginning of our series. We'll be learning together through the end of February. So let me ask you please to stand up from your seats. We do this as a community. Turn to the folks next to you and wish them good evening and welcome. And introduce yourself and say hello. Now don't sit down, stand up. You're going to be sitting a long time. Here's what you do. Put your arms around the people next to you. Draw them close. This way, even if you don't like the session, you'll go home and your family will say, how was it? And you'll say, I stood next to the best smelling Jew from Tarzana. It was a Makai. To learn together is a joy, it is a privilege, so we say a bracha for learning. And to be together is a joy and a privilege, we say a bracha for that. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, she'achiyanu v'kiyamanu v'kiyamanu b'zman. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, Shalom Aleinu v'Yakol Yisrael. 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 Please be seated. We want to welcome everyone tonight. Come on in, come on in. I'm Ed Feinstein. I'm one of the rabbis here at Valley Beth Shalom, and it's a privilege to have all of you here. If you're a member of Valley Beth Shalom, it's damn good to see you once again. It's been a long time since Yom Kippur, and you look a lot less hungry than you did then. If you're a member of another congregation, we're delighted that you're here. You're always welcome here, and we hope that you'll find a home and a place here to learn and to grow with us. If you're not a member of a synagogue, you should be. We'd love to have you. You can be my boss. Imagine the joy of picking up the phone every Monday morning and telling the rabbi what you thought of the sermon. That's what many of us get to do. Some of those messages I even listen to, so it's a joy. But we'd love to have you. If you'd like to become part of the synagogue, just I'll introduce some of the synagogue officers during the break, and we'll have a chance to chat with them. But we'd really love to have you part of our shul. We learn Torah every Shabbos morning at 9 o'clock. We pray every week, or every morning actually, and every evening, and we learn together. College of Jewish Studies is an effort to try to learn together as adults. We good? Good. There is a television commercial which I find very curious. It shows this jaunty little fellow, and he looks straight into the camera and he says, "Growing up, we were German. We wore lederhosen, danced in a German group," and he does a little dance, "and we were German. Ate bratwurst, I suppose. We were German." And then I got on Ancestry.com and started looking up my family and discovered we're not German at all. Then I sent my DNA away and discovered that we're actually Scottish. So I traded my lederhosen for a kilt. Now I watched this about 100 times because it keeps coming on over and over again. And it occurred to me once watching it like, what? You didn't know you were Scottish? Who told you you were German? Don't you know your grandparents? Like, how could you even think this? Now that, it turns out, is a classically Jewish American answer to that television commercial. My grandparents knew who they were, and I knew my grandparents. I knew what language they spoke, because they swore at me in that language, right? And I knew where they came from. And not only did I know what country they came from, what ethnicity they came from, I know what village they came from. I know who in the village they don't talk to this day. How you could think you were German and discover you're Scottish? But I guess there are Americans who know this, because Americans have this sense of, my life begins when my family came to America, and everything before that is erased. To be a Jew is to be part of history, and to live history, breathe history, and know history, and recite history, and to touch history. And the problem is that it's so important to us. History is so endemic to our identity, so foundational and core importance to what we are, that it never occurs to us that history is that important to us. But to be a Jew is to know history. To be a Jew is to be history. There's no commandment anywhere in the Bible that says you have to believe in God. There's no commandment that says you have to join a shul, only I really wish you would. But there is a commandment, it's on the handout. It says as follows. This comes from the Mishnah in Psachim. In every generation, each one of us must see himself as if he or she were redeemed from Egypt. That is, the core of identity is not to affirm a theological proposition, to say, I believe in this, or I believe in that. The core of identity is to tell a story about yourself in which you take ancient history and make it personal memory. And you include yourself, you implicate yourself in that story. And anyone who is prepared to implicate themselves in that story and to say, I was in Egypt and I was redeemed and I saw the sea split and I was there, is part of us. Is part of us. And everything that we are flows from that experience. We do have faith. But the faith, it starts with the experience and with the historical memory, and then you draw the faith conclusions therefrom. We do have ethics, but the ethics begin in that historical experience. History for us is identity. It's what we are. And it is a core of the Jewish experience. So this year, we're going to learn our history. We're going to take a survey of Jewish history. Now, Jewish history is very big. It's huge. It's 3,500 years, right? It's 3,500. It's three and a half millennia. So we're going to go really quick. Hold on. Okay? And what we're going to do is we have 2 sessions to get you ready, tonight and next week. Our guest next week is Professor David Myers, who is the professor of Jewish history at UCLA and now the recently appointed director of the Center for Jewish History in New York City. How he's going to live in both cities, I'm going to ask him next week. I want to find this out. But he's one of the leading historians of the Jewish experience in the world today. And then we're going to take Jewish history and very crudely divide it into 4 epochs, 4 eras. A biblical era, rabbinic era, medieval era, and modern era. And for each one, we'll take a session and do an overview. What are the major themes? And you'll see some of the questions that we'll ask. Do you have the handout?
Yeah.
If you don't, Louise is our preeminent, beautiful volunteer. Louise has a few more, and she'll pass them out. And you'll see at the bottom here, I'm going to give you some questions to ask about each one of these eras as we interrogate the era. We'll begin with an overview to understand the major features of that era. And then we're going to look at one or two personalities that were key to that particular era. Then we'll look at a book, a text, that was key to that era. Then we'll look at an issue, a problem, a dilemma, a challenge that was key to that era, so that we can understand how it was that Jews lived in that particular kind of, that circumstance. So the first unit of our study will be the biblical period, which itself is 1,500 years. We'll do an overview of that era, and our first guest will be Rabbi David Wolpe of Sinai Temple, who wrote a wonderful study of King David, his namesake. So we're going to ask Rabbi David to talk about King David. And then we're going to welcome Rabbi Zoe Klein from Temple Isaiah, who wrote a beautiful novel about the book of Jeremiah. And she's going to talk to us about the book of Jeremiah as a piece of literature. Then we're going to move on to the rabbinic period. We're going to talk about the rabbis, who they were and what it was that they did, what they accomplished, and how they accomplished it. And our guest will be Professor Christine Hayes of Yale University, who's going to talk to us about how Jewish identity changes during the rabbinic period. And we're going to look at some of the text of the rabbinic period, and our guide will be Professor Joel Garaboff of Arizona State, who will help us go through those books together, open those books so that we can understand them. Then we'll move on to the medieval period, probably after Christmas, and we'll be welcoming Professor Dina Aronoff of GTU, of Berkeley, who will be talking to us about Maimonides. Okay? A whole bunch of wonderful historians and teachers to take us through this survey of Jewish history. Tonight, I want to talk about what Jewish history is and how we treat Jewish history and the interesting problem of Jewish history. So let's begin back at the beginning. In every generation, every one of us must see himself as if he personally or she personally came out of Egypt. Which means that history becomes personal memory. That it's not enough simply to commemorate the event, to remember it, to mark it on the calendar. You've got to be there. And so it is that the night of the Seder, you recreate that event. You're going to eat what they ate. You're going to sit in your home as if it were the last night in Egypt. I had a friend who had a Seder once, and he said to us, wear traveling clothes and bring a suitcase. What I didn't know is what he meant was that the suitcase was what we were going to sit on for the whole night. So my wife had a really cushy one, and I had a Samsonite. I'm still sore from this day. And he said, put in the suitcase what you want to bring out of Egypt with you. And we each brought stuff, and during the course of the Seder, I recommend you do this, we opened our suitcase and each one of us took out that heirloom or that object and talked about why this would be the one thing I would rescue if I were running away from slavery. Because that night is the last night in Egypt. That night we are cozied and closeted in our homes, and the angel of death is passing over, and we are safe, and the world is dangerous, and tomorrow we're going to be free, and having been slaves, and having parents who were slaves, and grandparents who were slaves, the idea that tomorrow we're going to be free is both exhilarating and utterly terrifying. And that's the sense of the Seder. That's what it means to imbibe history, to eat history, to make history part of you. Now notice what it does. It's not history anymore, because it makes history into the present tense. That's what we mean when we say that in order to really use history, history becomes myth. Myth is one of the great words of contemporary social science and social study. Myth, with a small m, means a fairy tale, right? So you say there's the myth of. But that's not what we're talking about. This is myth with a big M. Myth with a big M is a truth told in the form of a story. Myth is when you take history and you make it my story, my story. It becomes my meaning. This affects me. This shapes the way I see the universe. So the Pesach story becomes myth. It becomes myth. And for Jews in every epoch, the Pesach story was right at the core of our identity. In fact, it's the one thing that you can be sure of, that it unites us as a people, because if you don't tell that story, that's what excludes you from the people. You may not believe this, but not every Jew keeps kosher. Not every Jew comes to Shul Shabbos. Not every Jew wears a yarmulke. Not every Jew eats gefilte fish. It's hard to believe, but it's true. Right? Not every Jew speaks Hebrew. Not every Jew votes Democratic. Not every Jew has visited Israel. Not every Jew feels guilty. Most. The overwhelming majority. But you see, the notion there is, well then what is it that unites us as a people? This is one of my core questions. What is the nature of our coherence as a social unit? What brings us together? And one of the elements that brings us together is that no matter what kind of Jew you are, you tell that story in the present tense and in the first person. I am a survivor of Egypt. I'm a survivor of Egypt. I was in Egypt, I was a slave, and I got redeemed, and that's who I am. Rita, it's right over here. We got a seat right for you. Okay? Come on. This is one of the elements of identity, because this is one of the core founding myths of the Jewish people. It's in the Torah itself. So take a look with me. Look at the way that the Bible then uses history and turns it into myth. And the end of the book of Deuteronomy, as Moses is talking to his people, he says to them, you're going to enter the land. Ki tavo al haaretz. You're going to enter the land. And when you enter the land that God's giving you as a heritage, you'll possess it and you'll settle it. You take some of the first fruits of the soil, which you harvest from the land the Lord God is giving you, put it in a basket, go to the place where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name. You shall go to the priest in charge at the time and say to him, to the priest, I acknowledge this day before the Lord your God that I've entered the land that the Lord swore to our fathers to assign us. And then you'll recite this formula. Now you recognize this because this is the core of the Pesach Seder. This section of verses was taken from the book of Deuteronomy and put into your Haggadah. This is right at the center of the Haggadah. My father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. There he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our pleas, saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm with awesome power and with signs and miracles. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil which you, O Lord, have given me. That is how an historical story becomes a myth, because it becomes present tense. Generation after generation, especially generation after generation, the farther you get from the original event, the more important this ritual becomes, because this connects you back to that event. It brings that event back into the contemporaneous world. And notice what it says. Look at the way this story is arranged. We were wanderers. We had no place in the world. We went to Egypt. There we were oppressed and almost destroyed. And we were rescued from there. We have this profound sense of rescue. And having been rescued, we were brought to this land, and this land was given us as a gift. The historiography, that is the way of looking at history of the Bible, is that everything you have in the world is given you as a gift from God because of your merits and the merits of your ancestors. Nothing you own. You're not entitled to anything. You have no claim on anything. You're only in this land so far as you please God. That's the historiography of the book of Deuteronomy. That's the historical myth of the book of Deuteronomy. And every time you bring those first fruits and you make this declaration, what you're saying is, I'm living in the world with a God who's watching over me. And all the gifts that I enjoy are gifts from that God. All of the blessings are gifts of that God, so long as I maintain the covenant that God established with me. This is a way of structuring human existence by telling the historical story. This is what myth does. Now, you might be asking this question. Is it true? I heard tell once of a rabbi who gave a sermon on Pesach, where he told his congregation that the Exodus didn't happen. Can you imagine? Is it true? Did it happen? Well, now, let me ask you the following question. Does it matter? No. Think for a second. Does it matter? What is the relationship between historical veracity and core memory? I mean, first of all, let me ask you a personal question. How many of your core personal memories are actually historically accurate? Tell me about your mother. Let me ask you a different question. Let's take a slightly different example of the way that history becomes memory. On the fourth Thursday of every November, we're all going to sit at a big table. A table laden with ritual foods, a large roast turkey. If it's kosher, it's grossly overpriced. Stuffed. And mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, and smooshed up little marshmallows on top, and cornbread and green beans in some sort of gelatinous solution. Pumpkin pie, cranberry sauce. And before we dig into this repast, what are we going to do? We're going to sit at the table, we're going to hold hands, and we're going to recite the American Haggadah. In the year 1620, our pilgrim ancestors left. Well, you may not use that melody because you might be Sephardic, but it's the same idea. In the year 1620, our pilgrim ancestors left the tyranny of England and crossed the mighty and forbidding Atlantic in a tiny boat called the Mayflower. And they arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts, which in November is no place you want to be. And when they disembarked from the ship, they started starving and they were dying. And out of the brush came the friendly natives who taught them how to survive in this forbidding continent. And because our pilgrim ancestors survived, the following year they held a feast of Thanksgiving and gave thanks to the natives for their help, gave thanks to God for his providence and bounty, gave thanks for the goodness of this continent. And so it is that every November we turn off the television and open up our hearts and sit together at the table and give thanks to God for all the blessings that we've enjoyed in this country. And let us all say, Amen. You all do that, right? Sure you do. Is it true? Is that story historically accurate? Well, no, wait a minute. There were a group of people who came from England to America. They did have a difficult time of it in Plymouth, Massachusetts. They were helped by the natives, and they did have a feast of Thanksgiving. Those parts of the story are true. What part's not true? Well, after dinner, they washed the dishes, said grace, slaughtered the Indians, and stole the continent from them. Oh yeah, that. That may not be true. What's even more interesting is, how many of you were on that boat? How many of your ancestors were on that? My ancestors were in Russia getting chased by Cossacks, right? And by the way, had they arrived, had some miracle of teleportation happened, and your Jewish ancestors had arrived in the Plymouth colony, what would have happened? Well, because the Plymouth people were seeking religious liberty for themselves, but were rather reticent to share it with people who were different than themselves. Yeah, that's also true. But that story is true. Why is that story true? It's not true as history. It's true as myth. Because as myth, it shapes the American experience. As myth, it says, we all came from someplace else. Right? Not to get political, but we're all illegal aliens here, thank you. Right? We're all DACA babies. Now, we came from tyranny seeking freedom. We came to a continent which was difficult. And there were forces here that made it possible for us to settle here. And we found opportunities here to develop and to grow. And for those opportunities, we're grateful to God. And we're grateful for the opportunities and the possibilities of this continent, the blessings of this continent. And so we have a ritual each year to recognize our gratitude, to ritualize our gratitude and to tell the story again. It's an American Seder. That's what Thanksgiving is. And it's not an accident, because the Pilgrims were Bible-reading Christians, and they knew what a Seder was. And they knew what a Feast of Thanksgiving was, and they knew what the power of ritual is to articulate gratitude to God and to one another. And the most important part of that story is what they call themselves, or rather what we call them. We don't call them immigrants. We don't call them aliens. We don't call them refugees. All of which is true. We call them what? Pilgrims. What is the definition of a pilgrim? A pilgrim is a person on a religious journey who goes from a place of lesser sanctity to a place of greater sanctity. You make pilgrimage to a place where you might stand in the presence of the divine. That colors the American project. That colors the entire mission of what it means to be an American. Because it means that we recognize that there is something cosmic in the project of this civilization. Sometimes that got us into trouble, because that was the origin of the idea of manifest destiny, that the whole continent was ours and anybody in the way would get run over. But most of the time, that gives us a sense that we are in service of ideals, far beyond our self-interest in living in this continent, because we're in service of God. We're in service of divine ideals. That's what makes this story myth. And you tell the story in the first person, no matter where you came from. Whether you came from Eastern Europe, or you came from Tehran, or you came from Israel, or you came from Canada, you tell that story in the first person because that's the nature of myth. It takes history and makes it my story. That's the nature of myth. So what's going on here in Deuteronomy is precisely the same thing as what goes on in the Thanksgiving story. Now then the question is, well, then what is the nature of study of history? Because when I start to study the story and I discover that the facts of the story are not as I was told in the myth, and I compare them, sometimes that leads to a deep sense of disenchantment, a deep sense of sadness. You take away my myths. You take away my stories. I want to believe that the founding fathers of the American Republic were just as the play Hamilton presents them. Terrific hip-hop singers. You realize that we have a whole generation of young people now who think that Hamilton, Jefferson, Washington, all of them sang hip-hop. You realize that's going to happen now. It's going to be impossible to get to tell them that it was different. But when we grew up, we were told something about, we were told something about the American founding fathers, and then we all went to college and took American history, and we discovered that there's a whole school of revisionists who believe that there's a different story. And what happens when you compare history with myth? I want you to hold that thought for a minute. I want to go a little farther into the myth. Take a look. There's no thought. Take a look at the next one. When we get to the rabbinic civilization, they're going to use history in a different way. The Bible is going to use the myth of the story of the Exodus to give us a sense that the land that we live on is a gift from God. By the time we get to rabbinic civilization, we're losing the land. And what do we have instead of land? Well, look at the story. Mishnah Avot, this is the beginning of the rabbinic tradition. This is the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Moshe Kivel Torah Sinai. Moses received the Torah at Sinai, transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the men of the great synagogue, and they gave it to us. Or put it this way. Moses got Torah from Sinai and gave it to Joshua. Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the men of the great synagogue. They gave it to the early rabbis, the Tanaim, who gave it to the later rabbis, the Amoraim, who gave it to the editors of the Talmud, the Sibaraim, who gave it to the first decisors of Jewish law, the Geonim, who gave it to the philosophers like Maimonides, who gave it to Mordechai Kaplan, who gave it to Harold Schulweis, who gave it to me. And tonight, I'm giving it to you. The myth of the transmission of a tradition from Sinai to us is the historical myth that's at the core of the rabbinic tradition. because that gives us an identity. And as the people of Israel were leaving the land of Israel and beginning to scatter across the Mediterranean, so that they were no longer citizens of a land, no longer subjects of a government, no longer concentrated in cities and towns in Canaan, in Israel, in Palestine, but now all across the Mediterranean and eventually all across the world. Now they have a different identity. Where once our identity was, I live in the land of Israel, I am subject to the king of the Judea or of Israel, I pay taxes, I serve in the army. All of a sudden, and it was quite all of a sudden, it happened in the year 70 in the first century, we're spread all over the Mediterranean. And we need a different identity structure. And when situations change, myths change, and a new myth arises, and this myth says what unites us is no longer our common residence in a land, our common government, our sovereignty. What unites us now is Torah. We have a book. And the study and observance of that book, the reverence we hold for that book, a civilization built around a book, that's going to become our identity. I want you to watch as identity changes from era to era. In the biblical era, identity was political. You lived in a land, you had a king, you served in the army, you paid taxes. By the time of the rabbis, we are now a diaspora people. We live everywhere. Identity is no longer living in the land. Identity now has to do with the book. If you're in a synagogue and it's time to pray, which direction do you face? Wrong. Try it again. If you're in a synagogue and it's time to pray, which direction do you face? Toward the Torah. Now, you might notice that this synagogues are supposed to face east. I didn't build this building. I'm trying to build another one. And for about $10 million, I can make it face east. Is there anybody here? But you're in this building. I think this is north. This is north, right? North, yeah. We're built by Canadians, you know. Facing the home. You face the Torah. Why do you face the Torah? Even if the ark is not on the eastern wall where it's supposed to be, over there. But why do you face the Torah?
The hallmark of our identity.
Because that's identity. Exactly right. Because that's the center of the universe. Now, if there's no Torah in the room, you can face Jerusalem, which is east. That you can do. And synagogues are supposed to face east. But if you happen to have a synagogue that faces either south or north, you face the Sefer Torah. Because that's where identity is. Because in a certain sense, that's Jerusalem. Your Jerusalem, not physical Jerusalem, but mythical Jerusalem, is wherever the Torah is. Because we became a diaspora people, we needed a new myth. And the new myth is the transmission of culture, the transmission of divine truth through the generations in the form of Torah. The most articulate expression of this was a book by a man named Yehuda Halevi in the 11th century. It's called the Kuzari, one of the most interesting Jewish books ever written. Halevi lives in Spain, and he lives in Spain as life in Spain is becoming dicey, because you're having a competition between Muslim groups, and the Jewish condition of life in Spain wasn't always tolerance in a golden age. It was difficult at certain points. And the community is feeling pressure. It's feeling political pressure, and it's feeling ideological pressure. And he writes a book called A Book of Argument and Proof in Defense of a Despised Faith. I'll give you a little bit of a sense of why he's writing this. And he writes it, ironically, it's a Jewish book, but he writes it like a Platonic dialogue. And it's based on a folk tale. There turns out that, and apparently this is actually somewhat true, because Arthur Kessler wrote the same story. There's a kingdom in Central Asia called the Khazars. And at one point, the Khazars converted to Judaism. And this became a story that circulated among the Jews of the first century. As the Crusades were going across Europe and wiping out Jewish communities, one of the ways that Jewish communities held on to their self-respect was by telling the story that far away there's this magical kingdom where everybody's Jewish. Right? The magical, the Emerald Kingdom, you know, the Emerald Palace. And so Halevi takes that folktale and he imagines what happened. And in this book called the Huzari, which is the Khazars, the story of the Khazars, he writes as follows: I was asked to state what arguments I could bring to bear against the attacks of the philosophers and followers of other religions, which differ from ours, and against the sectarians who differ from the majority of Israel. And I remember the arguments I'd heard of a rabbi who sojourned with the king of the Khazars, who, as we know from historical records, became a convert to Judaism about 400 years ago. To him there appeared repeatedly a dream in which it seemed as if an angel addressed him saying, "Your intention is pleasing to the Creator, but your way of acting is not pleasing." The king keeps having this nightmare. What you're trying to do is okay, but you're not doing it right, says the angel. So the king wants to know what tradition I should follow that will please my Creator. So the first person he invites is a philosopher, because philosophy offered this golden wisdom. Aristotelian philosophy in the 10th, 11th century was this gold standard of wisdom. And the philosopher comes and the guy says, "Teach me the way to be." And the philosopher tells him, "There's a God, but he doesn't know whether you live or die." And the king of the Khazar says, "Well, then that's not what I want to know. Because I know God knows me, and I want to know what I'm supposed to do to please this God." So then he invites the Christians, because the Christians own half the world in the 11th century. And he says to the Christians, "Teach me your truth." And the Christian teaches him the truth of Christ. And the Khazar king says, "How do you know?" And the Christian kings and the Christian teacher says, "Because it's written in the Bible." He says, and the Khazar says, "Whose Bible?" And the Christian says, "The Jews' Bible." And the king says, "Ah." You can say, "Ah." Good. Then he invites the Muslim, who owns the other half of the world, right? And he says to him, "Teach me your truth." So he teaches him the truth of the Prophet Muhammad. And the king of the Khazar says, "How do you know?" And he says, "Because it's written in the Bible." And the king of the Khazar says, "Well, how do you know it's true?" He says, "Because it's written in the Bible." So whose Bible? He says, "The Jews' Bible." So the king of the Khazar says, "I better invite the Jews." And he invites the Jew, and he says to him, "You know, I wasn't going to invite you because it's clear to me that your people can't possess truth. You don't own anything. The Muslims own this half of the world, and the Christians own that half of the world, and you guys are in trouble in both sides. So why would I want to listen to you? But I realize that it's your truth that's the foundation of everybody else's truth. So tell me your truth." Zach, by the way, just incidentally, just step back for just a second. It's not actually a bad exercise. It's actually a good homework assignment. I want to know the elevator speech for Judaism. No, seriously. You're standing in line at Gelson. No, Gelson's Jewish. You're standing in line at Vaughn's. And somebody looks in your cart and sees a frozen challah, a jar of gefilte fish, right? What else? A box of Slim Fast, and some Diet Pepsi. Diet Coke. It's the national drink of the Jewish people. And they say, "Are you Jewish?" And you say, "Yes." And the person says, "I've never met any Jewish people, but I've always wanted to meet Jewish people. What is Jewish?" Now, you have until the checker says next to answer that question. No, very seriously. That's an interesting exercise when you stop and think about it. Like, what do you say? Like, where do you start? Like, just. All right, so here's what he starts. What he says, right? So come with me in the text, right? The rabbi says, "I believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," that's Jacob, "who led the Israelites out of Egypt with signs and miracles, who fed them in the desert, gave them the Holy Land, after having made them traverse the sea and the Jordan in a miraculous way, who sent Moses with his law, and subsequently thousands of prophets who confirmed his law by promises to those who observed and threats to the disobedient. We believe what is contained in the Torah, a very large domain." So what does the rabbi tell him? He tells them the historical story of the Jewish people. He tells them history. He starts with our history. And the king says, "That's very curious." The king says, "I had not intended to ask any Jew, because I am aware of their reduced condition and narrow-minded views." No, narrow-minded, before that's right, but what he means by that is exclusive. You Jews you don't proselytize. I have never seen a billboard on Ventura Boulevard saying, make Shabbos taka, you know? I mean, there's billboards for everything on Ventura Boulevard, but never seen a billboard like recruiting for Shabbos observance, right? Have you? You ever seen one? Would anyone like to put one up? Yeah. Right? Talk. As their misery left them nothing commendable. Shouldn't you have said, asked the king, that you believe in the creator of the world as governor and guide, in him who creates and keeps you, and such attributes would serve as evidence for every believer? Shouldn't you have begun with something metaphysical? Shouldn't you have begun with something universal? Shouldn't you have begun with something rooted in reason instead of in history? Very interesting question. Is our Judaism rooted in a set of philosophical propositions about the way the world and life is? Or is our Judaism rooted in a set of historical myths and stories about where we've been and what we've done and what we've learned from what we've done? Just think about this for a second. It's very interesting. It's a very astute observation. Again, those of you who are practicing Jews are so used to speaking of history and myth that you don't even notice it. That it doesn't even occur to you. That's how we talk. But the king, who represents the larger world, says to him, gee, that's odd. I would have expected you to appeal to some universal truth, some universal, commonly accepted idea of what it means to be human and the meaning and purpose of human existence. That's what I would have expected. I wouldn't have expected you to refer to your own history and myth, because that's rather narrow. You see? It's rather constricted. So the rabbi says, that which you express is religion based on speculation and system, the research of thoughts, but it's open to many doubts. You see, if you base your religion on a metaphysical argument, if I somehow metaphysically or mathematically prove to you that God exists, well, you can find me a mathematical proof that I'm wrong. So Moses, for that very reason, that's what so means, for that very reason, when Moses spoke to Pharaoh, he told him, the God of the Hebrews sent me, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Right? Now, so when Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go, you all saw the movie if you didn't read the book, right? He doesn't say, God, creator of heaven and earth, sent me. He says, the God of my people sent me, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Not my creator and yours. He did not say the God of heaven and earth, not my creator and yours sent me. In the same way, God commenced this speech to the assembled people of Israel. At Mount Sinai, the beginning of the Ten Commandments doesn't start when God says, I am the Lord your God who created you. He doesn't say that. What does he say? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord you worship who has led you out of Egypt. He did not say, I'm the creator of the world and your creator. In the same way, I spoke to you, king of the Chazar. When you asked about my creed, I answer you as was fitting and fitting to the whole of Israel, who know these things from personal experience, and afterwards through uninterrupted tradition, which is equal to personal experience. In medieval times, uninterrupted tradition was considered verifiable evidence. Today, not so much. But in those days, that's how they thought of it. So here's the point. In each generation, in each age of Jewish life, we take our history and we shape a myth. It's a myth which gives us a reason for being as a people. It's a myth which organizes our identity. It's a myth which prioritizes our values. It's a myth which unites us as a people. Every generation, every era of Jewish life has its own myths. And as we change, as the people change, as our material conditions of our existence change, as the challenges we face change, our myths change. Our myths change. We go from a myth of living on the land to a myth of living through the Torah to a myth of having this historical experience that we share no matter where we live and what way we live. These are the changing myths of Jewish life. So as we talk about the history of the Jewish people, it's important to ask each generation, well, what's the guiding myth of that generation? And then that brings us to this moment now. Because now we have two interesting issues, two interesting problems. Problem number one is what I asked you a moment ago. Now that we study history, the study of history and the observance of myth are very different disciplines. They're very different ways of thinking. History is my story. Myth is my story. Myth is my truth. Myth is the truth that defines me. History is a detached study of the facts and the trends and the ideas of a particular historical era. History is detached and academic. Myth is engaged and personal. Right? What happens when they conflict with each other? What happens to Thanksgiving when I tell you the true story of those people who came from England to Plymouth Rock? Well, we even saw this. What happens to Columbus Day when we start thinking about Columbus in very different ways? Can we still have Columbus Day? Well, I mean, it's a really interesting question. And I don't know if you saw this controversy because it didn't get up here, but the Italian community in America got very upset because they took away Columbus Day and Columbus was their hero. What happens to my heroes when you do revisionist history and you tell me that my heroes were not quite the supermen and superwomen that I always wanted them to be? When you tear them down. You tear down the heroes that I want to have. But what civilization can exist without myth? And so this becomes one of the questions of modernity. How do I live with history and with myth? That's a big issue. That's number one. That's the first question. I'm going to answer these for you, don't worry. And here's number two. What's our myth now? What's the myth of Jewish modernity? What is the myth that unites us as Jews? What is the myth that prioritizes our values? What is the myth that inspires us? What is the myth that gives us courage to be? What is our myth? Do we have the capacity to create a new myth that corresponds to a new set of historical circumstances? That's going to be one of the issues that we're going to look at. That's going to be one of the problems that we're going to take a good peek at, because we're going to notice the way that each of the previous eras formed and shaped a myth out of its historical memories. And the question is, what should be the myth now? Can we even have myth now that we have history? These become very interesting issues. Everybody take a breath. Everybody take a breath. That was all the introduction. Now I'm going to give the lecture. That wasn't bad. You okay? Did I scare you? Did I scare you already? Really? Oh, that wasn't so bad. All right. One more thing, then we're going to take 5 minutes break. Is that okay? Can you last 5 more minutes? Okay. Now listen, I'm a middle-aged guy. I know how this does. Look at the last page. You see where it says interrogating Jewish history? Here's what I'm going to suggest you do. Those of you who like take notes, right? For each of the eras, for each of the sections of our learning, make a chart and answer these questions. Ready? Number one, the self. What is the nature of Jewish identity? So let me just give you a preview. In the biblical period, to say I am a Jew means something different than what it meant in the rabbinic period, what it meant in medieval Jewry, and what it means for us. I am a Jew for a person living in King David's kingdom meant I live in the land, I speak the language, I abide by the culture, I'm loyal to the king. Then all that gets wiped away and we become a diaspora people. No land, no king, no culture there, no temple in Jerusalem, none of it. Now what does it mean to say, I am a Jew? Well then that was the great project of the rabbis, to reformulate the myth and give us a new sense of identity centered on Torah. I am a Jew means I accept the truth of Torah and abide by its mitzvot. I wait for Messiah. Then comes modernity. And what does modernity say? You don't wait for Messiah. You are the Messiah. Recreate your Jewishness. We have not sufficiently answered that question. So the question is, what is the nature of identity? Has to be asked about each successive era. Can an outsider join? How do you join up if you're an outsider? In the Bible, how did people join the Jewish people? They married in, right? Zipporah, Moses' wife, was a Midianite priestess. When she married Moshe, she became a Hebrew school teacher. If you join the Jewish, you marry in, right? How permeable are the boundaries? Every culture establishes boundaries. Every identity has to have boundaries, right? You are or you're not. And there has to be some sort of a boundary if the identity is going to have some meaning. How permeable are the boundaries? How much do we put up walls to keep outsiders out? How suspicious are we of outsiders? Or how welcome are we of outsiders? In every era, we have to ask that question. And here's the one I want you to really think about. What's the ideal Jewish life? Who's the persona? Who is the hero who typifies the best of that era? Why King David? What is it about King David? This is what Rabbi Wolpe is going to help us understand. What is it about King David, who was such an engaging personality, such an engaging ideal type, that to this day, little kids in my Hebrew school sit on the floor singing, David, Melech Yisrael, Chai, Chai, V'Kayam. Now, anybody who's been dead 2,800 years, and people still say, Chai V'Kayam, he's alive and well. That's one hell of a personality. What was it about King David? Then, who was the personality in the rabbinic period? Maybe Rabbi Akiva. What did the rabbinic personality look like? Then when we move to medieval Judaism, what does medieval Jewish personality look like? Halevi, Maimonides, some of the Rashi or the European Jews. And then we come to modernity. What does the modern Jewish personality look like? What is the difference between being an Israeli Jew and being an American Jew? Anyone here have cousins who live in Tel Aviv? Or Haifa? By the way, if you have cousins in Israel, there's a difference being a Tel Aviv Jew and a Jerusalem Jew. And then there's a huge difference between being a Tel Aviv Jew, a Jerusalem Jew, or a Yotvata Jew. If you don't even understand that sentence, aha! Okay? What's the difference between being a New York Jew and being an LA Jew? Someone went, oh. Or a Nebraska Jew. There's a shul in Anchorage, Alaska called the Frozen Chosen. No, Emerson, it's true. It's true. I got a call. There's actually a friend of ours, Rabbi Showeiss, lives on an friend. We have a dear friend who lives on Kauai. And he calls every now and again to talk to me. And I say, I don't want to hear it. He said, I'm sorry, you live in paradise. A really sweet, good soul, a really wonderful man. And he's trying to build Jewish life on Kauai. So you'll be happy to know that I volunteered. I'm ready to sacrifice everything to go save the Jews of Kauai, right? I'm going to rename the island. I'm going to call it Alavai. But there's got to be something. You're a different Jew in Boise, Idaho than you are in Brooklyn. What is it? What is the ideal type of Jewish modernity? How do we establish a type? All right, number two. Here's the community. What is the social organization of Jewish life? In biblical times, it was the state, and it was the temple, the holy temple, the Beit HaMikdash. When the temple is destroyed and the state becomes out of bounds, Jews move to diaspora, we create completely new institutions. The synagogue, the school, the kehillah, the community. Different set of institutions. How do those institutions work? What are the major institutions? Who leads those institutions? What is the source of authority for each of those leaders? How do you get to be a prophet? How do you get to be a prophet? According to the Bible, how do you get to be a prophet? You go to prophet school? You take the SAT? No. How do you get to be a prophet? God shows up in your life one day and says, Jeremiah, you're a prophet. Jeremiah says, whoa, no, I'm a teenager. Right? God says, yeah, that's what I want. Loudmouth kid. Right? Raise some hell for me, right? How do you get to be a rabbi? If I told you that God came to speak with me, you'd get really scared. That's not how it works. You go and study. You master books. How do you get to be the Prime Minister of Israel? What's this? I'm not being facetious for a moment. Is the Prime Minister of Israel the leader of world Jewry? No. He thinks so. By the no, I'm not being facetious. He really does. Is he? But I want you to. One of the features of modernity, we're going to come back for in a moment when from the break, talk about this. One of the features of modernity, which we have to take into consideration, which we have not yet developed the myth for, is that we are now a sovereign nation. What does it mean to have a sovereign nation with a democratically elected government? And we don't live there. That's going to be an issue. What is the principal act of affiliation? How do you join the Jewish people? How do you maintain your membership in the Jewish people? What is the principal act of alienation? Now, you could say, I convert to another faith. Okay. By the way, in halacha, that doesn't work. You know that. According to Jewish law, once you're Jewish, you're always Jewish. Once you're Jewish, that's that famous case of the brother Daniel, right? He was a kid who was sheltered by a monastery during the Holocaust, and he became a monk, a priest, a Catholic priest. And he showed up in Israel and said, I want to become a citizen because I'm a Jew. Only Jews would do something like that. You know, and there was a very serious discussion about can a Catholic, because halakha, and the chief rabbinate came in on his side of the argument. They said, he's a Jew, you can't not, right? The government of Israel had a different opinion. What's the principal alienation, right? And again, I'm not being facetious and I'm not going to get political, but if a person were to stand up and say, I don't believe in the Jewish state, I believe we should give the land to the PLO. First of all, I'd get killed before he reached the door, but besides that, is that an act of alienation from the Jewish people? Should it be? Right? No. Don't answer me. I'm just asking questions here. That's my job, just to answer questions. I hired all these really smart professors to come answer them for us. That's the good news. All right, now let's look at beliefs and values. What big idea represents each period of Jewish history? Monotheism, big idea. Right? Scriptural interpretation, big idea. Chesed, big idea. Zionism, big idea. What books represent the period? What challenges did Jews face in each period? What did Jews create in each period? What was the principal creation of Jewish culture? And what theology characterizes each period? How did they think about God? And how did they think about who God is and what role God plays in their lives? And how is God served in each period? And then, because I don't have enough to think about, I gave you 4 more questions to ask. Number 1, we're going to see change, especially when we move from era to era. When something changes, how does it stay the same? You know the story about the farmer that had an axe? And someone asked him how long he had the axe. And he said, this axe? This is the best axe I ever had. I've had this axe for 40 years. I've changed the handle 5 times and the head 3 times. Best axe I ever had. Every cell in your body changes every 7 years, and yet you're still the same person. The Jewish people have changed. Your life and King David's life have almost nothing in common, and yet David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam. There is some sense of coherence across the ages and epochs and periods of Jewish history. What gives us that sense of identification and unity? How come that guy on television doesn't know that he's Scottish, and every one of you knows that you're Jewish? What is it that we identify with generation to generation that lets us call ourselves Jews? And by the way, that's not a small thing. When a Palestinian leader says Jews never lived in Jerusalem and never had a temple here, he's offering a counter myth to our myth that that's been our homeland since the very beginning. So the question is, what really is our identification with those people that had a land there 3,500 years ago? That's an interesting question. Here's a second interesting question. The stuff that we create as a people, to what extent are we driven by indigenous creativity, our own creativity, and to what extent do we take in stuff from the outside? We are, I will give you a hint, the greatest assimilators in all of human history. We are a cultural vacuum cleaner. Whatever place you've dropped us, we have sucked up the best of that culture, washed it clean of its non-Jewish elements, and made it part of us. I'll give you a great example. Anyone here speak Yiddish? What could be more Jewish than Oy Gewalt? Do you have some chutzpah, Takir? Yiddish. Yiddish is 80% medieval German, 20% Hebrew, and about 5% of the rest of the stuff smushed in. And yes, it doesn't add up because we're accountants. We can do this. But that's what Yiddish is the greatest example of assimilation. But I got better for you. The Pesach Seder. What could be more Jewish than that? It's the Greco-Roman Symposium put into Jewish idiom. Hatikva is the Moldau. It's a Central European song. You name anything that you say is quintessentially Jewish, and I'll tell you where we stole it from. Maybe our talent isn't indigenous creativity. Maybe our talent is creative assimilation. But then you've got to ask the following interesting question. So if Yiddish and the Pesach Seder and the structure of Talmudic logic and monotheism were all borrowed from other cultures and made our own, why aren't Christmas trees okay? If a Jewish family puts a Christmas tree and puts blue and white lights on it, why do we say, oh, no, that's not allowed? Even if you call it a Hanukkah bush. What is the difference between creative assimilation and toxic assimilation? That you got to tell me. Number 3, different Judaisms. Now you all know this from your experience now, but I'm going to tell you something. Whatever variety and diversity of Judaism you know in the world now is nothing compared to what it was in the first century. You have Chabad relatives who won't eat in your house, who won't breathe the same air you breathe, who think that you're a woebegone, lost soul, right? Nothing compared to what it was in the 10th century. Nothing compared to what it was in the late 19th century. In fact, we're more unified now than we've ever been. We have less diversity now than we've ever had. Now, your Chabad relatives will say, no. Just 200 years ago, everybody was a Torah true Jew. Sure. And they all wore long black coats. When Moses came down from Sinai, he was wearing a long black coat and a big hat, and he had a big gray beard, and he spoke Yiddish. Come on. Diversity has always been the watchword of this people. How does a culture tolerate such high degrees of diversity and still maintain cultural coherence and cultural conformity? That's going to be one of the questions we have to ask. Which forms survived and which forms didn't? Why did Christianity become a separate religion instead of staying as part of Judaism? And what would have happened if it had? What would have happened if it had? These are very interesting kinds of questions. Why did Christianity become a different religion, but Hasidism didn't? Really interesting kinds of questions. How do you tolerate diversity within uniformity, within unity? And finally, the question of all, which is, why are we here? Frederick the great Prussian emperor, was a great Enlightenment scholar. He wanted to know how he knew for sure there was a God. So he commissioned the philosophers and thinkers and theologians of his court to produce for him a proof of the existence of God. And they brought him a 10-volume encyclopedia of proofs for the existence of God. He says, too long, make it short. So they brought him a 1-volume encyclopedia of the proofs for the existence of God. He said, too long, make it short. They brought him a 1-page proof for the existence of God. He said, too long, make it short. And they looked at him and said, Majesty, the Jews. True story. Why are we here? How is it that this small, beleaguered people, Halevi called them a despised people, for much of our history we were, has crawled through every epoch of history and out-survived every great empire that came and conquered us, and they're all gone. And we're still here. We're still here. Right? One of the strange experiences you've ever had, you ever been to one of these Jewish museums? I guess Skirball qualifies, right? And you know what's odd about those museums? Like, here you have ritual objects in a case, right? A Kiddush cup, a tallis, a set of film. And doesn't it feel strange to see objects like that in a case? Because you say, like, let's break the case and liberate it. Bring that Kiddush cup to my table Friday night, fill it with sweet wine, and let's use it the way it's supposed to be used. You can build a museum to Greek culture, because Greek culture don't exist anymore. Socrates is gone. Roman culture, gone. Babylonian culture, Akkadian culture, Sumerian culture, medieval Christian culture, medieval Muslim culture, gone, 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 gone. And thank God, Nazi culture and communism, gone. Build museums to those cultures. But don't build me a museum of Jewish culture, because anything you put in that museum looks a lot better on my Shabbos table this Friday night. Because we're still alive. There's a Yiddish phrase, pasnish, it like doesn't go. To put that stuff in a museum, because museums are for dead cultures, and we're still alive. That's remarkable. How did that happen? How did that happen? These are the questions we're going to ask all these historians when they come to visit us. Now we're going to take 5 minutes to finish the brownies, gulp down some coffee, come on back in, and I want to talk about this question of the myths of Jewish modernity and what myth we need to create today. We'll come back, we'll finish by 9 o'clock. Don't take 5.